this is the central city share of new residential construction just over the last 15 years. So this is not, by most standards, what I would call the long-run picture here. And look at what happened just in the last 6 years. An enormous jump in cities around the country, some of which really have not been growing very fast. I mean, Philadelphia is still not growing, but they're moving into the downtown. And Philly hasn't built any new light rail lines. They haven't. It's still kind of a gritty place, I got to tell you. But people are building and buying in downtown Philadelphia and in other places which are much more economically lively, the same thing as well. And you can see it in Minneapolis too. And so I think we've all had the experience of driving, to Northfield or west or up to Brainerd to go to the lakes, and you see, that thing used to be a cornfield. The last 20 years I drove past it. Boom, 1 year later, it's a development. Change happens in 1 year. And I see it now. I drove down Lyndale the other day, a block I hadn't been down in some months, and all of a sudden there's a set of 4-story condos there. This stuff can happen fast. The market is going that direction, and I suggest to you that if the state and the transportation infrastructure that is necessary to allow that trend to continue gets in line, you will see a lot more of this here in Minneapolis as well. The good news is Reid had his own kid story, and I have mine. We love to canoe. I'm sure a lot of you do. I was looking for a pen, and the only thing I could find was a crayon in my briefcase. And I had to bum a pen off of John, but here's the proof. Anyway, if you've been in a canoe, you know that you can't steer a canoe that's in the water, that's just dead in the water, right? It has to be moving. Something has to be moving, the stream or the canoe. And I think that in this case, both are moving. The United States as a whole, the federal government is moving, public opinion is moving, the market is moving, and you've got an enormous flowing river, if you will, of demographic change that is going to need some place to live. And Reid is exactly right when he says all of these places are yet to be built and planned, and we can get ahead of that curve and put a paddle in the water and steer the canoe in the right way. And I'm actually very optimistic about our chances of doing that. So little addition to Reid, and once again, a suggestion that you read the MCAG report. I think it's an interesting piece of work, and I commend action on it to you. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. I was told I have between 5 and 8 minutes to present the statewide conservation preservation plan to you. I'm always game for trying to talk quickly, but I recognize that that's impossible. So what I did do is provide a little flyer out in the handouts, which I hope you got, which, if nothing else, gives you the website so that you could download the entire plan. It's also available on the LCCMR website and on our website at Bonestro. I want to just give you just a little bit of an overview of kind of some of the key aspects of the study and focus in on those that are related to land use practices. This is a kind of a graphic from the study that identifies the sort of three major areas of the study. And let me just begin by saying that I've been involved in planning in the metropolitan area here, the state of Minnesota, for 30 years. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the most comprehensive inventory and assessment of the state of our natural resources that's ever been done in the state of Minnesota. I don't claim to have experience throughout the United States, but I don't think there's too many states that have as comprehensive a snapshot of the state of our natural resources as we do. And part of that was just looking at the land and aquatic habitat. That is, on a landscape scale, looking at the state of our natural resources and pulling together all of that information, much of which was involved in a GIS format. The part that I co-chaired with Dr. Les Everett at the university was the land use practices and transportation part. And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between land and aquatic habitat and land use practices in a minute. But the third part of it was energy production, use, and mercury. It's just sort of a general breakdown. So the study itself looks at a number of different things. One, it looks at all of the ways in which our planning isn't being integrated as well as it needs to, and the opportunities that are lost as a result of not doing that. One of the things that the LCCMR asked for specifically, those of you, this is a pretty sophisticated audience, but those of you who don't know, the LCCMR is charged with spending our lottery proceeds. And so one of the things they said in particular is we want to know where there is critical habitat need, where there's habitat, either land or water, that's in real danger right now to development. So we certainly did that. We also looked at areas around the state where there was real need for land and water restoration. We looked at sustainable practice in timber harvesting and agriculture and in land use practices. And then we also looked at all of the existing kind of incentive packages. What are the ways in which we incent the use of farmland and timberland and urban land? Looked at the ones that are there and looked at some others that might be looked at as an opportunity for change. So if we really boil it right down, what we looked at with the land use practices team was to identify those public and private land use choices that are needed to improve environmental quality and, to the extent possible, to anticipate and adapt to environmental changes in Minnesota. One of the things that was a real eye-opener to me is just how fast things are changing. And the tendency to make policy decisions based upon the conditions you see today, only to realize that that's not going to be quick enough to deal with the changes coming down the road, was something that was a real eye-opener to me. And then finally, to identify land use practices and policies that would best support these choices. So that was sort of our to-do. So that land use practices team focused on basically how land is used on a particular parcel. Again, we did a lot of mapping, and scientists at the university looked at kind of what's the condition of land in northern Minnesota, the Arrowhead, southwestern Minnesota, and so forth. We were really focused on how's a particular farm operated, or how's a particular community being developed, to look at those kinds of best practices. And we broke down land use practices into three components: urban development or community development, agricultural, and forest. Now, one of the things that won't surprise you is one of the elements that was really cross-cutting across all of the different land uses was water. And one of the things that many of us are aware of is that we have some very serious issues with respect to impaired waters and a lot of pressures that are being put on water for the future. When you think about urban development, you think about in terms of increased impervious surface. And this was some work that was done by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, trying to identify where the likely increases in impervious surface will be. Interestingly, most of those are in the Mississippi Basin. 93% of those are in communities that are located within just 9 watersheds. And you can look at that information in greater detail in the study. So I was talking to someone before the meeting about some potential legislation, and they was basically asking me about what they ought to call it. I've had the experience of living through several names that got politicized, like smart growth and community-based planning and so forth. So we coined our own, and hopefully it hasn't been shamed yet. We called it conservation-based planning, which really includes a lot of the same elements as community-based planning. A lot of it isn't rocket science. But one of the things that I really want to emphasize, and I do every time I talk about this, is there's a real tendency when people talk about conservation development to think about second tier and third tier. And I would suggest very ardently that there are conservation-based strategies in the core, in the first-tier suburbs, and second-tier and third-tier, and so forth. And so we talked a good deal about a variety of different strategies for urban areas, for developing the developing edge, and for rural areas. And we recognize that just as you look back at that last slide about where impervious surface is going to be increasing, we know that transportation corridors are a magnet, if you will, for increased development. So we did suggest some prioritization along those rapidly developing cores. Hold that last part about AUAR certified comprehensive plans, because I'm going to talk about that a bit in a minute. But this is just a graphic that hopes to make the case about conservation-based strategies, are strategies for close-in areas and developing areas as well. The image on the upper left-hand side is the development that occurred when the Apache Plaza Shopping Center was redeveloped in the city of St. Anthony. Now that was a single land use, a market obsolete suburban retail center, 100% impervious. There wasn't a bit of that site that was pervious. And this redevelopment, granted, those of us who are designers and urban planners could pick away at it, but there's hundreds of different types of housing styles within walkable distance of new retail. There's community amenity, community park, and several $100 million worth of reinvestment. And significantly, every inch of that property now is treated, pre-treated before it discharges into Silver Lake. So here is a completely developed suburb with what I would suggest is a conservation-based redevelopment. And some of the others are kind of more traditional conservation.